My name's Bally. I live next to the Isle of Skye in the West Highlands of Scotland. I'm a prawn creel fisherman, and I also represent other prawn creel fishermen and divers in the area of lone pack fisheries. I come from a family of fishermen and I live on the coast in a coastal community, so I mean it's essentially I'm born into it to some degree, I suppose. My earliest memory of fishing is probably going out in the boat with my dad at knee height, and the first thing he ever taught us about being on a boat was do not pee into the wind. Almost all of the fishing industry left in the inshore of Scotland is based on shellfish, mainly around two principal species, which is nephrops, also known as Langostera prawns, and scallops. But essentially all of the demersal fish have gone in my lifetime at the fishing. And the fish species that my grandfather caught were different than my father caught, and the species that we catch now were very different from the ones that my father had in his time. I mean, the ecology has changed in ways that my grandfather probably would never believe. Bottom trawling and dredging are variations on a theme. They're active or towed demersal gears. So basically you take the fishing net and you pull it along the seabed. So that's trawling, and there's quite a few variations on the theme. And then dredging is essentially a variation of the theme, but except the dredge is normally a rigid structure as opposed to a net. You use some kind of a beam or rake, and then often, because it's being dragged along a lot harder ground than a net, you use a chainmail net. Both are similar in that you're pulling a structure along the seabed. Bottom trawling affects me in that it's changed the environment I have to fish in, the species that we have access to fish to. It's restricted the opportunity for my community, such that we're a single species fishery now in my community, and it's changed the whole ecosystem. So the ecosystem is in decline, in almost perpetual decline, and my thinking on this is that it would never change until such a time as we remove bottom trawling and dredging from that ecosystem. Otherwise it cannot recover. The problem with trawling and dredging is the impacts are huge. They're over a wide range of species, and not just like commercial species, they impact the ecosystem itself, so they kind of modify the habitat. As you pull the gear over the seabed, the flora and fauna of the seabed gets changed to more simplified species that can handle heavy gear being dragged over it, and often not very many things can handle heavy gear being dragged over it, so you end up with a much simplified ecosystem, and it's an inherent consequence of dragging heavy things over the seabed in a repeated manner. And the seabed will always remain in that denuded state until such a time as you stop dragging heavy things over the seabed. My initial experience working on bottom trawlers was going out with my dad, my grandfather. I worked on trawlers quite a lot when I was younger, and some scallop dredgers as well. And as far as the supply chain is concerned, my father left commercial fishing to set up a prawn processing factory when prawns became the dominant species. There was a huge opportunity to get in the supply chain. So my dad became the principal buyer and seller of nephrops in the northwest coast of Scotland for nearly 20 years. And so when I wasn't fishing, I would often go and work in the processing factory to make money until I could get another fishing job. And I've seen the change over time. That factory is now closed, and there's not enough prawns left from the west coast of Scotland. So in the time that I've been in the industry, I've seen it going from herring to whitefish to prawns to now not very many prawns. Not so many prawns that we can even have a processing facility in my village anymore. Working on bottom trawlers and dredgers was pretty hardy. I mean, they teach you to be quite hardy when you're a young man going into the fishing. And you don't just have to be hardy to the weather and the long hours of work. You have to be quite hardy to the thing you're doing. You have to be able to shut your eyes to killing lots of animals. Many of these animals you don't really need to kill because you're not targeting them, you're not making money off them, but they're killed as a consequence of the job you're doing. And I found that quite hard, and it's why I didn't stay in the trawling sector. I prefer the creel sector where I work, which is a very highly selective fishing, and for me that's far more morally acceptable way to be a fisherman. I think if we don't try and clear bottom trawling out of significant areas of our seas, then our seas will continue to decline. So I think it's absolutely fundamentally important that we remove bottom trawling certainly from areas where we have alternative fishing methods. Often bottom trawling becomes the dominant fishery because the alternative fishing methods are either more expensive, more labour intensive, or maybe not as profitable. But where there are profitable and viable alternatives to bottom trawling, they should almost always win over. But yet, when it's opened up to unregulated competition, bottom trawling wins. And I think unless we start restricting bottom trawling in the significant areas of our seas will continue to decline. That means what we'd probably call spatial management. So you basically say this space is reserved for anybody who's not doing bottom trawling. So I think we have to be very careful when we try to shift bottom trawling at an area, because you can get unintended consequences both in the ecosystem and social and economically as well. But if we do it right in the longer term, you wouldn't be allowed to bottom trawl anywhere there would be a viable alternative. That's what I would argue would be the ideal scenario. I would like decision makers to protect the most sensitive ecosystems and fisheries that are vulnerable to bottom trawling activity, and displace bottom trawling away from anywhere where there's a viable alternative. And that way we're not swapping fishing jobs for conservation. I think really truly believe we can have conservation and fisheries in the same place if we allow areas for low impact fisheries that are not bottom trawling. I think, well, there's two things the public can do. I mean, they can vote with their cash and their feet, and they can choose products that aren't caught by bottom trawling. But the second thing they can do is they can emphasise to their decision makers and their politicians that they don't support having bottom trawling right up to their shores, or they don't support bottom trawling displacing their lower impact fisheries. And I think, politicians often don't so much act on science or anything else, they act on votes. So if people tell politicians they won't vote for the types of politicians that don't promote marine recovery and low impact fisheries, then the politicians will probably act. I think there's grassroots movements around most countries to fight against heavy industrial fisheries, especially ones that are displacing lower impact fisheries. So I think the more people that join these grassroots movements, the more people that support environmental NGOs that support small-scale fishermen and that advocate against industrial fisheries, I think the better. I mean, if you're a member of the public and you want to do something about this, ask about how the fishing is done in your area and start advocating for the kind of fishing you believe should be done.